Hi everybody, and welcome back to Scary Nightmare. Before we begin, make sure to drop a comment below by letting me know where you're watching from and what time is it for you. And if you haven't subscribed yet, smash me that subscribe button right now. And for now, let's continue our Scary Nightmare adventure. 1, 2, 3, action. One last thing. If it ever goes dark in the middle of the day, just stay in your house tonight. That's what the driver said before falling silent. I chuckled at the bizarre suggestion, as if it hadn't been enough to instate a ridiculous nightmare curfew and forbid any romantic attachments with the inhabitants of the town. They also wanted me to hide from the dark? Detective, this ain't no joke. If you can't follow these instructions, we're turning around and I'm taking you back to the city. He slowed down the car and looked back at me. He hadn't been the friendliest person at all. I mean, hell, he hadn't even given me his name, but the pure intensity of his stare made it clear how serious he actually was. All right, as you wish. Why would it go dark in the middle of the day anyway? Last time I checked, there wasn't a solar eclipse scheduled for this year. Before the driver could answer my half-serious jab at his rules, a van came speeding towards us. He pulled us to the side of the narrow road, allowing the van wish its flashing blue lights to pass unobstructed. In the split second where it drove by, I noticed two police officers occupying the vehicle. They seemed to be in a hurry, I said, expecting the driver to explain. Seriously, why are they driving out of town in such a rush? I continued. Well, they're looking for Patrick, the dumbass who tried to leave town a few days ago. I guess a local hunter must have found him or something. His second comment piqued my curiosity. The ominous insinuation, said in such a casual manner, meant I had to keep digging. What is going on? Are you trying to tell me that he is not allowed to leave? Of course he is. Don't be stupid. It is just that he trailed off. Just that? What? That's what I asked. Then the driver was like, listen, I'm just a damn driver. If you have any questions, the sheriff will be happy to fill you in. He seemed on edge just having me in his car. I'd offered to drive into town myself, but the powers that be had insisted I get picked up, as the road was treacherous and confusing. Based on what I'd seen that far, they hadn't lied. The road was broken and in dire need of maintenance, and there were almost no signs to guide our way on our journey. Before long, we passed by the first road sign I'd seen in hours, just a simple piece of wood with the town's name written on it. Tenebrous, not a particularly welcoming sight, but it served its purpose. After another mile or so, we pulled onto an almost empty street, no more than 5 minuscule buildings that were supposed to be houses. The driver parked outside one of them and got outside. After you drop off your stuff, I'm taking you down to the sheriff's department, and that's what he said. Before he entered my humble abode, the driver walked over to a power box and flipped a switch. Dim lights flickered to life, barely illuminating the dark interior. The place was run down and barely comparable to a 2-star motel. Not that it mattered while I was on the job. Luxuries had never been a part of my work. And as we entered, bugs and insects scurried away from the wet doormat covering the floor. The place only seemed to have 3 rooms. The main one was a living room with a sofa bed and a stove. A hybrid room for all purposes. Other than that area, there were 2 doors, one leading to the bathroom and one with a sign reading curfew pantry. I tried to open it, but the door wouldn't budge. How come it's locked? I asked. Without speaking a word, the driver walked over and gave it a solid pull. After the 3rd or so attempt, it flew open, revealing hundreds of cans, non-perishable goods. It was enough to feed a family for about a year. Then I said, I'm only staying a month. You know that, right? I asked that nervously. Then he sighed and nodded. It is just for emergencies. If it suddenly goes dark, there is no telling how long we will be stuck for. So in case the sun vanishes, I just stay here? For how long? I asked half sarcastically, still skeptical to the whole situation. Then he thought for a moment before responding, saying usually just a couple of hours. He trailed off. I said, usually? He said, God knows. It could be longer. I said, how long? And I asked that firmly. He fell silent again, not willing to answer the stream of questions I kept producing. Just drop your damn bags and let's go visit the sheriff, he ordered. Without further argument, I put my bags down on the table, careful to keep them away from the bug-infested floors. I chuckled briefly to myself, thinking that in the very least I wouldn't be lonely. And as we drove through the town, I got a better look at the tired-looking buildings. They seemed so ancient, as if they had been built back in the 50s and subsequently forgotten about. There were a few people out on the streets, all looking cold and exhausted beyond measure. None of them particularly excited to have a stranger visit them, it seemed. The sheriff's department didn't fare much better than the rest of town. It was a mix between an office building and a jail, too small to keep many criminals in place. But I suppose that in a town that small, crime wasn't much of an issue, at least officially. The deaths had all been ruled accidental. An older man came to greet us as we arrived, accompanied by two younger officers. He wore a thin smile on his face, a tired one at that, but the first sign of friendliness I'd met. I reached out my hand, and he gripped it firmly. Then he said, "You must be Robert," as he was shaking my hand. Then he said, "I'm Bill Riley, the sheriff around these parts." And when it came to the other two officers, they didn't smile. They just stared at me with suspicion in their eyes. Then one of them asked, "Why is he here anyways?" The sheriff turned back towards him, with his smile vanishing, replaced by a stern look. The man fell silent, and the sheriff redirected his attention towards me. "Don't mind them. It is good to have you here. We're in dire need of a forensic pathologist," especially after he said before I interrupted him. Then I said, "Hold on for a moment. I'm not a pathologist. Not anymore, at least." Then he responded by saying, "But your file said so." "That was a long time ago," I said quickly. The sheriff took the hint and didn't push the issue any further. Before we get inside, a van pulled up behind the building. It was the same one I'd seen speeding past us as we entered the town. The sheriff rushed over to assess the situation, and they pulled a covered stretcher out from the back. "You found him?" the sheriff asked surprisingly. The officers nodded and carried the stretcher inside. We followed them in through a set of metal doors, which led to an old-fashioned autopsy lab. The distinct smell of formaldehyde burned through my nose as we got inside. The sheriff pulled the covers off the stretcher, which revealed the pale corpse of a middle-aged man. While the cause of death wasn't immediately apparent, I suspected some sort of cardiovascular condition, with his eyes deep red from conjunctival bleeding and his legs swollen. Then the sheriff asked, "Where'd you find this guy?" "Just at the edge of town. He didn't even make it across the border. Poor bastard." That's just what I said. Then they all stared helplessly at the dead man on the table before directing their attention at me. "Robert, would you mind assisting us with the autopsy?" I took a step back, and the sheriff noticed my trepidation. With a look of mild concern, he put his hand on my shoulder, and then he said, "Look, I wouldn't ask if I had another choice. I'll stay behind and help, but I just can't do it on my own." After an eternity of uncomfortable silence, I put the discomfort aside and agreed to help. I realized that while most of the officers in the room had dealt with dead bodies, none had ever dealt with dissecting a cadaver. Just the act of cutting a human being into their most basic parts was something entirely different that I'd never gotten used to. Together, we jotted down all the basic information regarding the man who I had come to know as Patrick Lawrence. After taking down his weight, height, age, and observed all the minor wounds, bruises, and other recognizable marks on his body, time had come to get the scalpel. Then he said, "You don't have to be here for this." I looked at the profusely sweating sheriff, and then he said, "I'm fine. Do you have an autopsy lab?" But no pathologist in sight. That's what I asked, more to get his mind off the side in front of him than out of curiosity. Then he said, "Yeah, we do." Then I said, "Where is he?" Then he said, "You're looking at him," he said as he gestured to the corpse in front of me. I felt ashamed. Being from a larger city meant that all my cases had dealt with strangers, but in a town as small as Denbras, everyone was either a colleague, friend, or family. Then I said I'm sorry as I was mumbling. Without further ado, I sank my scalpel into the man's abdomen. The blade cut through the skin and fat without a problem. I created the typical Y-shaped incision necessary for easy access. Then I put my hand down the newly formed hole, ready to expand open his cavities. Inside, I expected resistance. I fumbled around for a bit with the wet and slightly warm sensation of decaying organs brushing against my head. Panic started to rise in my body as I realized that instead of half-rotten organs, I felt nothing. Then I said, no, that cannot be right. And I was mumbling that to myself. Then the sheriff said, what? Then I said I kept expanded until his entire abdomen and chest cavity were visible. There within Patrick Lawrence, instead of a heart, lungs, kidneys, and liver, there was nothing, just a few chunks of what resembled minced meat, as if something had shredded him to pieces from inside. The two of us stared at the empty corpse on the table. The sheriff, as disgusted as he must have been, he didn't seem all that surprised. Then I began asking him quietly, and I said, do you know anything about this? But I said this with a demanding tone. Then he said, no what? Then I said, what state the corpse would be in? And I said that in an agitated way. Then he sighed and said, no, I didn't. According to the vague reports about the town that had been given, at least a dozen people showed up dead every year, while the number on its own was ludicrous for such a small town. It would be impossible not to have noticed their complete lack of internal organs. Do you really expect me to believe that, after all the people who died here in the past few decades, that none showed up like this? Come on. Then the sheriff said that's the thing, they never showed up, as we were leaving the autopsy lab. Then we walked into this office where he pulled out a bunch of photos, all showing what appeared to be extremely decayed and partially skeletal remains. We always found them months after the fact, and by then, it wouldn't be much of a surprise if wildlife had stripped their insides. But this is definitely something else. He put the photos away and locked his office. So then I asked him, you never found any fresh hollowed out corpses? Then he said, no, not really. Well, actually, Patrick, his last autopsy seemed to have disturbed him. Then I asked the sheriff and I said, what happened? He said 3 days ago, our local pharmacist went missing at night. And when we found him the next day, he'd be long since died. And Patrick did the autopsy. Then I said, and? Then he kept raving about the emptiness inside, making no sense. It was like he'd completely lost it, which isn't all that weird, considering the job. But we didn't know exactly what he saw. He burned the body before we could stop him and fled town. Then we exited the building to report to the other officers, all of them smoking, relaxing as if nothing had happened. He briefed the others while I lit up a cigarette of my own. A nasty habit I hadn't quit years ago, but considering the circumstances, it literally felt appropriate. The sheriff kept glancing at his watch and then at the rapidly setting sun. Time had gone away from us within the windowless autopsy hall, and curfew was about to start. Then the sheriff said, you better be home. Come on, Robert, I'll catch up with you in the morning. I immediately tossed a half cigarette down on the ground, and I said, wait, first, you're gonna tell me what the hell is going on here. The sheriff said, tomorrow, I promise, as he was reaching out his hand, saying, I appreciate your help today. I really do. I then hesitantly agreed to leave. The driver took me back to my house without speaking a word, and I headed inside to get ready for a restless night. It was an uncomfortable place to live, with boring food and a bathroom that had no functioning light, meaning I had to use the provided flashlight just to take a piss. Can you imagine that? Then as I was chilling in my house, I searched the pantry for something to eat, and to my surprise, I found an unopened bottle of whiskey just resting there. I drank it while going over the case files I'd been given prior to my departure towards Tenebris. 5 detectives had been sent there before me, all who returned unsettled, but none the wiser regarding the strange deaths. By the time I finished half the bottle, I drifted off to an uneasy slumber, a sleep filled with complicated nightmares from my past. Events and impossible situations I struggled to escape, but that had ultimately landed me here in Tenebris. I then woke up in the early morning of the next day with a splitting headache and an overabundance of regret. I glanced at the time to see it had only gone past 7 a.m., meaning I still had ample time to recover. The first daylight peeked through my window, and I grumpily covered them with the curtains, hoping to get another hour of sleep before I got up. I could have sworn only a second passed before I woke again to a bizarrely warm air around me. I got up, intending to open a window. When I noticed it was completely dark outside, I was absolutely surprised and in panic. I was worried that I'd slept through the whole entire day, all hungover and annoyed. I grabbed my phone to call the sheriff. Then when I noticed the time, it was literally still 7:42 a.m., which means only 40 minutes had passed. I stuck my head out through the window and tried to get a look around back again. Even the streetlights seemed obscured by the darkness, their yellow glow barely visible. I dialed the number to the sheriff's department, but he didn't pick up. Then I attempted to call him on his personal number. He picked up almost immediately, but his voice was obscured behind a static-like mist of sound. "Rob, it stands, keeps, don't." That's literally how he sounded like. I literally managed to get out before the connection broke. I slumped back down in bed, the driver's warning playing on loop in the back of my mind. If it ever goes dark in the middle of the day, just stay in your house and hide. Then I saw someone move out on the street, just a shadow hidden in the dark, with the warning of dangers lurking in the dark. I was torn between hiding or calling out to check if the person needed help. He wasn't far away, so I could run outside and get him safe easily enough. I literally began talking to this guy and I said, "Hello, are you alright?" My voice muffled as if the air itself had grown too thick. The shadow heard my call and turned towards me. It literally moved with unnaturally exaggerated movements, seeming to skip steps. At first I thought it was one of my neighbors, but even as it walked under the partially dimmed streetlight, it still didn't come into proper view. It dawned on me that the thing wasn't human. I wanted to duck away from the window and hide, but I was frozen in fear. My eyes kept focused on the slowly approaching figure. Then I noticed another shadow approaching from down the street, and another, dozens of shadows wandering the streets of Tenebris, all of them heading towards me. To be continued.